Here's your text, revised with proper paragraphing and punctuation. I'm a mover and truck driver for a large company that helps families move across the country. Mainly, my team of movers and I go to a house where everything is already packed in boxes, and we load them onto our semi-truck along with their furniture. Then, I drive the truck to their new home and unload it with a smaller team of local movers hired by the company. The biggest portion of my job is driving, since we specialize in cross-country moving. I had been at this job for 4 years at the time and had been a truck driver for over 10 years. I'd heard about things like this happening, but I never thought I would be put in a situation like that myself. The move was from Lower Tennessee to Upper Michigan. Not the longest drive compared to my usual, but still a full day's trip. We finished loading everything up by midday, and I began the drive at 2 p.m. The first several hours were completely normal. I drove about 6 hours without a single stop before eventually pulling over to get some food. I continued driving for another hour. At this point, I was in the lower to mid part of Illinois, which is all plain farmland. The highway narrowed down to a long, single-lane road with nothing other than the occasional farm or forest on the sides. As I drove through the darkness, with only my headlights lighting up the road, a small light appeared far in the distance ahead of me. As I got closer, it became clear that it was a car's blinking hazard lights. However, I could see both the front and back lights blinking, indicating that the car was parked sideways on the road. I slowed down, knowing I'd have to carefully maneuver around them into the oncoming lane. When I was about 100 feet away, I noticed another car visible in my headlights. It was parked with its front almost touching the other car, but all of its lights were off, explaining why it wasn't visible from a distance. Together, the two cars completely blocked both sides of the road. I stopped my truck about 20 feet away, leaving it on as I assessed the situation. Initially, I thought they might have had an accident, but there was no visible damage to either car, and they both seemed parked almost perfectly. Of course, I started to feel nervous about the possibility of a surprise attack, so I grabbed my small pistol from the center console. It made me feel a bit safer, but I'd never had to use it before. If there was a group planning an attack, they were almost certainly armed as well. What confused me most was the hazard lights being on. It seemed strange to give away that there was a roadblock if this was a trap. I stayed in the truck, looking all around the scene and the side of the road for any signs of someone being there. But there was no one. There wasn't really any way to turn the truck around, and even if there was, the nearest detour was miles back and would add several hours to the drive. It just wasn't an option. I sat there for probably 5 minutes, nervously swiveling my head, expecting someone to appear at any moment. After no sign of movement or noise, I decided to check on the cars. I was terrified, flicking the safety off my gun before leaving the truck. Once I got out, I stood by the open door for a minute, ready to jump back inside if needed. Then, I slowly made my way toward the small car with its hazard lights on. My truck's headlights shone through the entire inside of the car. It was clean, nothing unusual. I tested the door handle. It was unlocked, which made me even more uncomfortable. Who would leave their car unlocked in the middle of the road? Inside, I noticed the car was in neutral. I looked toward the back of the car and saw nothing but a flat field of grass. After glancing around the area one more time, I went to the front of the car and began pushing it. It only took a few seconds for it to start moving, and once it did, it continued fairly easily. The front of the car was still slightly on the road, but there was now enough space between the two cars for my truck to fit through. As I started walking back to my truck, I heard a loud voice in the distance. I turned around and saw a figure sprinting toward me from down the road. I ran straight for the truck and got inside. In my headlights, I saw 2 more men running alongside him, holding something in their hands. By the time I got the truck moving, they were already near the 2 cars, still sprinting toward me. I lined up the truck to go between the cars and ducked my head slightly as I drove past, just in case they started shooting. Thankfully, I was able to get away unharmed and put a good distance between us without any signs of them following me. I tried calling the police soon after, but I had no signal until about 30 minutes later when I got closer to a small town. I told them about what had happened, explaining that I wasn't sure if those people needed help or if it was a trap, but it felt incredibly unsettling. There's a chance I pushed an innocent person's car off the road who needed help, but the whole situation seemed too perfectly set up for that to be the case. I still don't understand why they were so far down the road if they were planning an attack. Whatever the reason, it might have saved me from something horrible. I am a male and was an Uber and Lyft driver for a couple of years while I studied in college. I was lucky enough to own a fairly new car with great gas mileage, so driving people around was no big deal, and I always saw it as easy money. I've never been the most talkative guy, though, so I usually just say hello when they get in and skip all the awkward small talk. Most of the customers I got were other college students who needed a ride back to the dorms or out to a house party or something. Due to my school schedule, I mainly worked between 6 p.m. and 2 a.m., depending on the day. On this particular night, I had started at 8, driving around 10 to 15 customers before eventually picking up a guy around 11 p.m. On the app, it showed his pickup location on the side of a small neighborhood road. This wasn't all that unusual, but when I pulled up to his location, I didn't see him anywhere. It was dark, and the roads weren't very well lit. I pulled off to the side and put the car in park, looking around. All I could see was a gate up ahead, blocking off the neighborhood from regular traffic, so I couldn't go any further. I decided to try calling the guy since I didn't know what else to do, but after a couple of rings, he declined. Almost a second later, though, the back door opened and a man got in. I had no idea where he could have even come from, but I assumed I must have just missed him somehow. "Hey, are you Tom?" I asked, making sure it was my customer. "Yeah," he replied quietly. So, I shifted into drive and made a 3-point turn to get out of the neighborhood. I wouldn't say I'm the most cautious Uber driver at night, but I definitely pay attention to make sure I don't get stuck in a bad situation. Occasionally, I'll glance in the mirror to see what they're up to. Doing this, I noticed something was off about the man. He looked like a normal 30-year-old guy, but he almost seemed nervous as he was fidgeting with his hands and staring at the floor. It was pretty weird, and it gave me a bad feeling. He had requested a 15-minute drive to a house just outside of my college campus. About halfway through, things started getting much weirder. "How close are we?" he asked in a somewhat shaky voice, like he was nervous. I told him we were 8 minutes away. A moment of silence passed before he leaned forward, partially between the front seats. "Is everything okay, sir?" He immediately leaned back in his seat but didn't respond. We made eye contact in the rearview mirror, but he quickly looked away and began fidgeting again. Obviously, I knew something was off. I took this chance to look at him in the mirror, trying to see if he had any weapons. There were no signs of anything big like a gun, but I wasn't sure whether or not he had a knife. I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept racing, thinking about all the horrible things that could possibly happen to me. We were just 4 minutes away when the man leaned forward again. "Could you just pull over here and drop me off?" he asked. Looking around, the road was quiet, and there were no cars nearby, which did not make me feel safe at all. Are you sure? Your stop is just a couple minutes away," I said, trying to convince him to let me keep driving so I could get to a safer area. "No, drop me off here. I need to get off here." I slowly pulled the car off to the side, holding my foot down on the brake, stopping the car but keeping it in drive. I politely told him to have a good night, hoping he'd just get out. Of course, he stayed. There was a really strange few seconds of total silence as neither of us moved or said anything. Then, the man suddenly jolted forward, reaching for my phone. I slammed my whole body into his, causing him to drop the phone in the crack between the seat. We continued to struggle as he reached around the front seat, frantically trying to grab anything he could find. The car constantly jolted forward because I couldn't keep my foot on the brake. After maybe 20 seconds and many unsuccessful attempts, the man leaned back and ran out of my car and off the road. I immediately drove off and away from the scene, calling 911. I was shaking and breathing heavily as I tried to explain what had happened. Thankfully, they seemed to understand pretty well. To sum everything up, it turned out the guy was using his friend's Uber account and was found pretty quickly. I feel really lucky to have gotten out of that unharmed, as the guy didn't even bring a weapon from what I know. He didn't have a history of violence or anything, so I guess that explains why he was nervous and unprepared. It almost seemed like he didn't even want to do it. I still drive for Uber and Lyft, but I stopped doing really late night drives, and I'm definitely a lot more cautious about who I pick up now. I nanny 2 amazing children for a single mother who owns a pretty successful small business, which means she can't be home for her children as much as she wants to. The children had a play one Friday night that their mother couldn't attend, so of course, I stood in for her. The play ended at 7, and we had to hurry home so that the kids could eat and be in bed by 8:30. They usually had to wake up early for their respective sports practices. It was fall, so the sun went down pretty early, and by the time the play ended, it was pretty much pitch black outside. I got them settled in the back seat, and then we headed home. The family lived pretty far from the school in a really nice neighborhood, where your neighbors are a good walk away, and you're pretty secluded from everyone. Most of the drive was along a winding road with very few street lights. There were no sidewalks, and the road was so narrow that you almost couldn't fit 2 cars. Luckily, no one really drove on this road since there were only 4 or 5 residences in this particular subdivision, which is why I found it odd when a car started trailing me really closely. I thought it must be just one of the older people in the area who can't see well, so I ignored it until they turned their brights on. The speed limit was 15 miles per hour the whole way, so I decided to pull over to let them pass. I wasn't about to speed up on a road like this, where I could barely see. However, the moment I pulled over, they pulled over too. Panic fell over me, but my mind tried to reason with the situation. If they're going down this road, they probably live here. Maybe my brake light was out or something. I looked at my rearview mirror as a man got out of the car and waved. I locked the doors as a precaution and rolled down my window slightly. He approached the car with a smile and asked me if a certain address was down the street. I didn't recognize the address, so I said no. I noticed, though, that as he asked the question, he kept looking at the kids in the back. Obviously, this made me very uncomfortable. I told him I really had to get home and apologized. He looked disappointed and said, "Those are some cute kids you've got back there. What are your guys' names?" That was the last straw. I told him goodbye and slowly started pressing the gas. Just as I began to move forward, he tried to grab the door, then punched the trunk and yelled after me as I drove away. The kids were getting frightened, and I tried my best to remain calm. I called the police and explained exactly what had happened. While I was still on the phone, I saw headlights behind me. He started honking his horn aggressively. The operator told me to stay on the phone and that officers were on their way. He was tailing me dangerously close, and I knew that if I even tapped the brakes, he would crash into me. We were almost to the first house on the street, and I was praying with everything in me that the people who lived there were home. I wasn't about to lead this guy straight to where the kids lived. As we approached the house, I started honking incessantly. The guy behind us slowed down as I turned into the driveway of the home. I saw an older lady look out her window, and a wave of relief came over me. The lady and her husband came out, and I explained everything. Just a few minutes later, I heard police sirens in the distance. They took my report right there and escorted me and the kids back to the house. Their mother showed up about an hour later. After I told her everything, she asked me what he looked like. I described the man as best as I could, and she just stood there, frozen. After a bit, she finally said, "He found me." I asked who, and she replied, "My ex-husband." Apparently, several years ago, she had gotten a restraining order due to several incidents where her ex-husband had tried to take her kids. So, I guess this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Thankfully, I never had to see him again, as the police were able to find him fairly easily.